Hello, everyone. I thought I'd take a few minutes to think about how you evaluate an argument from scratch. So, we've been spending most of our time this week looking at different parts of evaluating arguments. So, we've been thinking about validity, we've been thinking about soundness, we've been thinking about premises and conclusions. So, you might wonder, these tools are great, but what about if I am just kind of reading an article or reading something further on down the line? For us, we're going to be taking a look at some arguments from different philosophers. So you might be wondering, how do you take an argument in an actual passage from a book and use these tools to figure out what exactly is the author saying, and are they saying good things? And most importantly, are they giving me a good argument? So let's just take a couple minutes to walk through a passage from one of Plato's dialogues, and hopefully that'll help us to get a better sense of how to use these tools of validity and soundness and premises and conclusions to think about the arguments that you come across in whatever you're reading. All right, so remember that when we are thinking about an argument, we're thinking about premises and conclusions and how those premises relate to the conclusion. So if we are kind of getting the sense that someone's giving an argument, we will need to be keeping our eyes peeled for what's the conclusion and what's the premises. So here's going to be the 6-step process for how to figure out an argument from just something that you read, like an article, or a textbook. So first, what we're going to do is read the article or the argument carefully, and we're going to take our time. If you're trying to figure out the argument that an author is giving, you don't want to skim through, you don't want to read lightly, you want to take the time to really think about what is the author saying. Second, once you figure out, you've slowly read the article, you kind of have somewhat of a sense of what the author is saying, ask, what's the author arguing for? And this is how we're going to find the conclusion. So we want to think about, is there anything being told to me that the author's trying to convince me to believe? Are they trying to get me to agree with them? And if so, if you're getting that sense, what exactly are they trying to get you to agree with? Once you've found that conclusion, next ask, what are the reasons that the author is giving you in support of that conclusion? So once you figure out what the conclusion is, what they're arguing for, why are they arguing for it? Or in another way, as to ask the question is, what are the reasons that the author is giving for thinking that their conclusion is true? And then once you've found some of those reasons, try to put that argument in the best form possible. So sometimes arguments are not going to be as straightforward as what you are going to see in your textbook. And you'll see that in the example I'm about to do. But just do your best to figure out the conclusion and set up the arguments, or I'm sorry, set up the reasons, and just try to figure out the reasons and list those reasons, and then look at the reasons and the conclusion together and see if you can figure out the structure of the argument. And that's how you can put that argument in the best form possible. All right, so once we have our argument and we've got it in a pretty good form, we have to ask, is the argument valid? And so we'll use the steps that are given by Schaefer-Landau. So remember, his steps are to, once you found your argument, assume that the premises are true. Then you've got to ask, if these premises are true, then could this conclusion be false? And that'll give you a way to figure out, is this argument valid? And then once the argument is valid, you want to ask, is the argument sound? So assuming that the argument is valid, because remember, you might come across an argument that actually isn't valid. So once you figure out if that argument is valid, then you want to ask, is the argument sound? So that means, if you remember, that the argument is valid and it has all true premises. And then, just because of the way the way that validity works for arguments, if your argument form is valid and if your premises are true, your conclusion is going to be true as well. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this passage. So we're going to just do step one, and we'll read the article or this passage carefully to figure out what is going on exactly. All right, so here we go. Let us reflect in this way too, that there is good hope that death is a blessing, for it is one of two things. Either the dead are nothing and have no perception of anything, or it is, as we are told, a change and relocating for the soul from here to another place. If it is a complete lack of perception, like a dreamless sleep, then death would be a great advantage. For I think that if I slept soundly and did not dream, and put it beside the other days and nights of his life, and then see how many days and nights had been better and more pleasant than that night, not only a private person, but the great king would find them easy to count compared with the other days and nights. If death is like this, I say it is an advantage, for all eternity would then seem to be no more than a single night. If, on the other hand, death is a change from here to another place, and what we are told is true, and all who have died are there, what greater blessing could there be, gentlemen of the jury? If anyone arriving in Hades will have escaped from those who call themselves jurymen here, and will find those true jurymen who are said to sit in judgment there, Minos and Rhadamanthus and Achaeus and Triptolemus, and the other demigods who have been upright in their own life, would that be a poor kind of change? Again, what would one of you give to keep company with Orpheus and Musaeus, Hesiod and Homer? I am willing to die many times if that is true. It would be a wonderful way for me to spend my time whenever I met Palamedes and Ajax, the son of Telamon, and any other of the men of old who died through an unjust conviction to compare to my experience with theirs. I think it would be pleasant. Most important, I could spend my time testing and examining people there as I do here, as to who among them is wise and who thinks he is, but is not. Okay, so before we proceed, just to give you some background on this passage, this comes from the dialogue, The Apology, where Socrates is basically giving his defense before a jury as to why he is not guilty of the charges that have been brought against him. So the charges that are brought against him are basically that he's corrupting the youth of Athens and that he doesn't believe in the gods. So Socrates spends time defending himself against those charges, but he ends up being convicted. And this is his defense at the end when he's talking about just his views on death. Okay, with that being said, let's see if we can figure out what is going on in this passage. So Socrates has talked a lot about death and blessing. Let's see, what else? So we've got death, we've got blessing, great advantage, and he uses advantage several times. So here it is again, and there's blessing again. So Socrates seems to be talking about things that are a blessing. All right, but he's talking about death in this passage. And he's talking about why he thinks it's a good thing, right? So he talks about death being a lack of perception here. And he also talks about, let's see, death being a change from here to another place. All right, so it seems to be talking about death and what it's like. And then he seems to be talking about how these different ways that he thinks that they're like are good. So if it's a lack of perception, like a dreamless sleep, then dreamless sleeps, they seem to be restful and they're a good thing for us to have. Also, if death is a relocation, he seems to think that something good happens there too. He's going to meet all of these really great people. All right, so he seems to be arguing that death is a good thing. All right, so now that I've got that part down, is there a statement in here that explicitly states that? And I think that there is. And it's this statement right here. So our conclusion seems to be, or what's being argued for, is that death is a blessing. Okay, so now that we've got the conclusion down, now that we've got an idea of what's being argued for, now we need to think about how is Socrates arguing for it? What are the things that he is saying to try to back up this claim? All right, so let me go back into the passage. Let's go back up and just take a look at our list of how to evaluate an argument from scratch. All right, so we've done one. We've read the argument in the article carefully. We took our time. And then we asked, what's the author arguing for? And we found the conclusion. So step 1 and 2 are done. Now we're going to focus on step 3. We're going to ask, what are the reasons the author is giving in support of that conclusion? And we need to be on the lookout for multiple reasons. Okay, so let's go back in here to this passage. Okay, so death is a blessing. Now, sometimes what can help you figure out a conclusion versus a premise are these little indicator words. So think about when you give reasons to someone. So let's say, you didn't show up for a club meeting or something. And you say, well, I didn't show up because, or I didn't show up for the reason that. We have these kind of cue words in our language that kind of give a little signal, bing, 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 that we're about to give a reason for something that we just said. So the words that you would want to look for are, let's see, words like for, because, for the reason that. Now, you should use this kind of way of thinking about premises just as a guidepost. Sometimes an author is not going to signpost those for you or say for or because, but they will indicate just in their language and how they structure their sentence that, hey, here's the reasons why I think this. So let's see, I see for in a couple of places, so let's check it out. If there is a for, we need to see what it's there to tell us. All right, so right after the conclusion, Socrates says, for it, speaking of death, is one of two things. Either the dead are nothing and have no perception, or death is like a change and relocating for the soul from here to another place. So what Socrates says is, look, death is two options, right? And he thinks that death is a blessing, and he's going to launch into that. And this is kind of a cue word to kind of signal, hey, he's going to start talking about the reasons that he's going to give. So let's just kind of list these down here, and as we go, we'll kind of see what he's up to. So premise 1, death is either perceptionless existence, or it is a relocation of the soul. Okay. So we've got that part down, and we kind of know from reading the article that he's going to talk about these two things. So let's see what he has to say. How is he going to support death being a blessing by using these two assertions about what death is like. Okay, so let's see what he says. So Socrates did mention, if you remember, that if death is a lack of perception, then it's like a dreamless sleep. And dreamless sleeps we think are kind of good. So if you ask anybody, Socrates thinks, they're going to say, yeah, man, when I had that really good sleep, no nightmares, no dreams, it just felt deep and restful. So Socrates seems to think that if death is like a perceptionless, if death is perceptionless existence, then it's like a dreamless sleep, right? So he compares those two, and he says it right here. And then notice he's giving us another 4. Here's the reason that he thinks that a dreamless sleep makes death a great advantage. Because a dreamless sleep is a blessing. And he uses different words to mean blessing. You could call it an advantage. What else does he use? I think it might just be advantage or blessing that he uses here. He also uses words like pleasant. So he's using those words in the same sense in this passage. So we'll just say a dreamless sleep is a blessing. All right. So once Socrates has shown why he thinks that perceptionless existence is a blessing and so death is a blessing, he moves on to argue for why the relocation of the soul would be a blessing. Okay, so he says, if on the other hand, death is a change from here to another place, and what we are told is true and all who have died are there, what greater blessing could there be, gentlemen of the jury? If anyone arriving in Hades will have escaped from those who call themselves jurymen here, they'll find gods like Minos and Triptolemus, Orpheus, Musaeus, and Hesiod. And he thinks that that would be a good thing because these are people who are just. Because notice he says the other demigods who've been upright in their lone life, those are the kind of people we're going to meet when we get there. So what he's saying is basically, if death is a relocation of the soul, then we will meet the just dead in that afterlife. Okay, so then Socrates claims that this is a good thing. He thinks that meeting the just dead, or if you want to put it another way, meeting our just heroes in the afterlife would be a benefit to us, right? So he thinks, I am willing to die many times if that is true. He thinks it's a wonderful way to spend his time. And he thinks just being able to talk with them, to compare his own injustice that he faced with theirs would be pleasant. So he thinks that meeting the just dead in the afterlife is a blessing. Okay, so let's see. Now we've got our argument. So I think we've pretty much exhausted the reasons that Socrates gives. I don't see anything more that we could add. So before I move on, I've gone through figuring out the premises somewhat quickly, but I just want you to know that sometimes it can take a long time to figure out what the premises are and to get them in really ship shape before you're able to go on and evaluate the argument. So we could even make this just a tad bit better by cleaning up the language. So Socrates moves from talking about the relocation of the soul in the beginning of the argument to talking about relocation of the soul to an afterlife. So now that we know that, we have a sense of the argument, we can kind of go in and clean this argument up a little bit and make our language cleaner so that our reader knows what we're talking about. All right, so we could just talk about death is either a perceptionless existence or it's a relocation of the soul to an afterlife. And that's the sense of what Socrates means, right? So part of what you're going to be doing when you're reconstructing someone else's argument is pulling out the reasons that they give and also giving them, putting them in a way that captures the sense of what the original author said. And that is part of what it means to put the argument in the best form possible. So I've moved on to step 4. And part of what that means is just kind of taking a look at the reasons once you've got them or you think you've got them, just cleaning things up a little bit to make it look the best that it can, make the argument or the premises really sharp. So let's go in and clean this up. So if death is a perceptionless existence, then it's like a dreamless sleep, and a dreamless sleep is a blessing. So we'll just keep the blessing language since that's what Socrates uses in the conclusion. And we'll keep cleaning up the premises. So we'll fix premise 4 to match premise 1. If death is a relocation of the soul to an afterlife, we will meet the just dead in that afterlife. And meeting the just dead in the afterlife is a blessing. All right, so we've got our language cleaned up. We've got our premises cleaned up. All right, let's move on to step 5. Okay, so step 5 is to ask, is the argument valid? So we're going to use the steps given to us by Schaefer-Landau. So here's what we need to do. We need to assume the premises are true, and then we have to ask, okay, if I assume these premises are true, could the conclusion be false? Okay. Now, this is where things get a little bit tricky, and this is where I tend to see the most confusion when it comes to trying to figure out whether the argument is valid. So imagine things this way. You are not at this step trying to evaluate whether you think premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, premise 4, or premise 5 is true or not. You're not evaluating whether you agree with them or whether Socrates has good reason to think that these are true. You're not concerned with the truth of these premises. You're not concerned about whether these premises are true in our actual world. So think about validity as kind of like you are imagining a world in which these premises are true, whether they're true in our actual world or not. So think about like, science fiction or something, right? So part of the joy of science fiction, and sometimes part of its weirdness, is imagining a world that's very different from our own. And so when we do the tests for validity, we're kind of doing a science fiction game, right? We are imagining a world in which all of these premises are true. We're imagining a story in which these premises just play themselves out. And in that story, we don't want it to happen that these premises are true in the story and this conclusion still be false. So we got a couple things to think about. So we're imagining a world in which death, there's only 2 options for what death is like, and those 2 options lead to blessing, all right? So if you've got only 2 options for death, and both of those options are a blessing, it seems like it has to follow that death is a blessing, right? If perceptionless existence or relocation of the soul both lead to blessing, it's impossible for death to not be a blessing because those are the only 2 options for death. So we have to say that this argument is valid. There's no way that if these premises turn out to be true, that this conclusion is false. So this argument is valid. Okay, So now we've gone to our imaginary sci-fi world, imagine it this way, where these premises are true. And we've discovered that in the world where these premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. All right, so now we're gonna zippity-doo-dah back to the real world. And we're gonna think about whether the argument is sound. So remember, we've done step 5, and now we're moving on to step 6. If the argument's valid, then we have to ask if the argument is sound. So remember, there's 2 parts to soundness, right? So an argument is sound only if the argument is valid and all the premises are true. Okay, and then just remember, given the nature of validity, if the argument's valid and your premises are true, your conclusion is going to be true as well, because valid argument forms are what logicians call truth preserving. So that means, like, if you plunk in true premises into a valid argument form, it's going to give you a true conclusion. So that's the funness of a valid argument form, but it's tricky to figure out which ones are valid and which ones aren't. Okay, so let's head down here. All right, so let's kind of scooch this on down so we can see the premises and conclusions together. So what do we think? Is the argument sound? So I'm actually not going to give you the answer to whether it's sound or not, because this is the part where philosophy just gets interesting. So there's much more agreement on whether certain arguments are valid versus whether they're sound, because you could find things in here that are controversial. Premise 1 is controversial, right? Death is either perceptionless existence or it's a relocation of the soul to an afterlife. How do you show that? What kind of evidence do you provide to show that that's true? Do we have reasons to think that maybe it's not true? Maybe you might think, sure, those could be your 2 options, but maybe perceptionless existence isn't like a dreamless sleep. Maybe you might think, like, well, if it's perceptionless, how do you perceive that a dreamless sleep feels good, right? So that's kind of something that we might doubt. Maybe meeting the just dead in the afterlife might be a letdown. Maybe they're not quite the people that you thought they were, or maybe in talking to them, you find out things about their life that maybe history didn't record. So maybe meeting the just dead in the afterlife would not be a blessing. So soundness is harder to establish than validity. Now, in certain logic books, they might not point this out, but when you actually start doing a lot of I guess the rough and ready work, we might call it, of philosophy, of actually getting into the arguments, it's harder to see whether something is sound or not, because people disagree about the truth of the premises. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that just because there's disagreement, that means that there is no fact of the matter about things. It might just be the case that both sides have really good arguments for why they think something is the case versus not. But what I hope that you will get from this fact that soundness is harder to establish than validity is that this is where basically you're going to have to do a lot of the footwork. If you think an argument is a good one, if you think it's sound, you need to show good reasons for thinking that, yeah, all the premises are the case. So if you're giving your own original argument, you'd need to give good reasons for why the premises are true. And if you're disagreeing with whether a premise or several premises in an argument are good, or if you're disagreeing with the truth of those premises, you need to give good reasons as to why those premises aren't true. So if you think premise one isn't true, you need to give a good reason to think that death is either one of those things, or there's like a third option. That's one way you could show or cast doubt upon the truth of premise one. So I hope that this tutorial is something that'll be helpful for you as you go throughout the rest of the course. Um, Definitely use this as something to come back to, because we'll be doing a lot of argument evaluation and trying to dig arguments out of things like articles and just other things we might read from our textbook. All right, and this is the end of this tutorial, and hope to see you soon.